Hello, welcome back to the Physicians of Culture Philosophy podcast. I'm Glenn McLaren, a lecturer in philosophy at Swinburne University of Technology, Melbourne, Australia, and I'm here with my co-host, Arran Gare, also from Swinburne. Hi, Arran, how are you?
I'm good, thank you.
Good. Today we're going to talk about politics. And, of course, you've published pretty extensively in the field of politics over the years and philosophy of politics. But I think what really characterises your work and distinguishes your work has been your strong Aristotelian and Hegelian influences in seeing politics as being indistinguishable from ethics or being, intimately tied to ethics.
That's right, yes.
And also perhaps the old Greek concept of telos as well.
Yeah.
And in terms of purpose. And certainly I think this is the way to go when talking about politics, because I think what we're seeing in the world at the moment is, a complete lack of ethics in our politics in many cases.
Yeah, or a very superficial ethics based on the idea that basically people are really egoistic and they need a bit of constraint through some kind of Kantian ethics or whatever, which doesn't really have any impact on how they actually behave, because they've really accepted that life is just about trying to dominate everyone else so that you can satisfy your appetites and reducing everyone and everything to instruments.
Yeah. So if we take a step back a little bit, I mean, it just makes sense that ethics and politics go together, doesn't it? Because if you think about the ways in which human beings set up their various settlements, the way in which you organise yourself as groups, and that, of course, is the strong influence of Hegel in seeing humans as being fundamentally social creatures.
Yeah.
So if you think of them as social creatures, then the way in which they organise themselves socially, then politics and ethics are all the same thing.
That's right. Yeah. Well, it's just taken for granted by the early Greek philosophers that we're part of a polis or community. And then the reflections on that, interrogating their own institutions and beliefs, automatically link the two. So you find that in Plato's Republic. But then, more clearly articulated in Aristotle's work. And he had two separate books, Nicomachean Ethics and Politics, but they're meant to be part of one work.
Yeah.
So the Nicomachean Ethics tries to work out what you should be aiming at in life, the ultimate good, eudaimonia, and then the Politics, looking at the various constitutions, trying to work out how you can organise society, what kind of constitutions you should have so that people can live the best possible life. So that's, I think, what he called the archaea of politics, and I think that still should be recognised as such. It hasn't been transcended. It should permeate all our thinking. And to some extent, the reaction against Aristotle didn't totally abandon that way of thinking. The big break occurred partly, I suppose, with Machiavelli, but more completely with Hobbes.
This is like that 17th century break with Aristotle.
That's right, rejecting the Aristotelian cosmology, Christian cosmology, and replacing it with the mechanical view of the world, and then the conception of humans as complex machines, essentially moved by appetites and aversions, all reasoning being calculation in the service of self-interest, how to control things.
And removing that idea of telos too, removing the idea that there is some ideal society that you can aspire towards or move towards in some ways.
That's right. Well, to some extent, Hobbes was concerned about maintaining order, but he characterised humans in such a way that there's no place for reflection about what you should aim at. Yeah. It was just assumed on the basis of his conception of what humans are, that they have appetites and aversions, and you just provide the conditions for people to satisfy their appetites. And these are the ideas that got embraced by the economists, rejecting Renaissance economics, and incorporated into the notion of Homo economicus. And they've dominated ever since, not entirely because there's reactions against that way of thinking, but these are the ideas that were incorporated into John Locke's political philosophy, a sort of watered-down Hobbesian political philosophy, seeing society as a social contract between egoistic individuals entering into a contract for their own self-interest. No place for reflecting on what that interest should be.
And when you do reflect, I mean, I know in my own reflections on ethics and politics over the years, there's these two distinct streams or narratives seem to run through it all, which really go back to, I guess, ontological views of what you think life is fundamentally, what you think
Mm.
human life is fundamentally, and whether you have a negative or positive view of human nature.
That's right. Well, that's pretty important. I mean, the positive and negative view of human nature, you find St. Augustine believing that humans are basically evil.
Mm.
You know, you have this original sin. So they have to be educated and so on so that they can control their evil impulses. And to some extent, you can see that Hobbes just accepted that, but didn't believe that you could be much better apart from being manipulated and controlled by fear of punishment.
Although he probably believed he could be better.
Yeah, maybe. But I think that he just accepted that he himself was just self-interested. Rousseau, reacting against that, argued that we're basically good, but we get corrupted by society.
Yeah, that's right.
And the revival of Greek philosophy, to some extent, was very strongly influenced by Rousseau. You know, Rousseau strongly influenced these German thinkers like Kant, Hegel, Schelling, Fichte, and so on. And that's the alternative tradition. And I think the best way to characterize it in terms of the opposition between communitarianism, which sees us as essentially social beings, and that atomistic individualism, which sees individuals as independent of society, and then society coming afterwards is based on a contract.
And it's bound up with, you know, determinism and possibility as well, isn't it? You know, whether you think humans have the possibility of being able to improve themselves and create something better.
That's right.
World,
it does.
or is it just all, you know, all set, all determined as to be horrible and nasty and to destroy ourselves eventually?
Yeah. Well, if you look at Hobbes' work, I mean, he was, I suppose, developing his political philosophy as part of developing a self-interest. You know, you work out how you can avoid a state of war of all against all, in which life will be short, nasty, and brutish. So the idea that you can actually have some kind of freedom, I think, is presupposed in the communitarian notion of political philosophy, and there freedom is something that has to be cultivated, developed. It has to be developed in each individual so that they can uphold the kind of community in which they can be free. Whereas the Hobbesian tradition just talks about getting rid of the state so that people can just act self-interestedly.
Well, freedom really is at the heart of this, isn't it? Because, like, in terms of ethics, you know, one of the first discussions you have around ethics is about freedom, really, because without freedom, the ethics doesn't seem to make any sense.
That's right. But again, you've got that problem of how do you define freedom?
How do you define freedom? That's right. And
because
in your work, what's you know, what I was introduced to in your work was this idea of being two types of freedom.
Yeah, well, at least two types. There's probably more, three types perhaps. For the Romans, being free was not being, or being at liberty was not being enslaved, which is being dependent upon people who can harm you. So for that, you have to create a society, a republic, which is the people's thing, so that people are not subject to the will of others that they can't control. So that's the whole basis of kind of good constitution, inheriting those ideas from the ancient Greeks. And for the ancient Greeks,
within a slave-based economy.
Yeah, well, it was a slave-based economy. They assumed that there had to be slaves, and the Greeks tended to think that way too. Not perhaps Plato, but for the Greeks, freedom was associated with being autonomous, which means providing limits to yourself, being self-limiting. And you can see that running through, the alternative tradition. Even in Kant, you're truly free when you act according to principles which you will to be a universal law, which means you constrain yourself.
Yeah.
It's not being free from any constraints. Whereas the alternative notion of freedom, being free from any constraints, sounds as really good, But when you look at it, the outcome is bound to be some people subjugating others.
Which gets us back to what we were talking about in our earlier podcasts about process philosophy and the importance of constraints in causation.
That's right, yeah. So developing a whole cosmology that legitimates that way of thinking. But that's the sort of thing the Greeks were doing. The first Greek philosophers were philosophers of nature, and Anaximander talked about the universe beginning as unbounded and then being bounded or limited.
Mm-hmm.
And that sounds as though he's just talking about cosmology, but he was at the same time talking about society, what the polis was. It had to be self-limiting.
I think that's what, I mean, a quote from Hegel that's always stuck with me was that idea of, we are born in chains and then we have to learn to be free, or we have to learn to become individuals.
Yeah, that's more Rousseau.
That was, yeah. Oh, that's, yeah.
Rousseau. Yeah, so we're born in chains and yet we're not free anymore. Well, he's a bit contradictory because he said that, but later on he recognised that in actual fact the babies aren't all that free. They have to have some kind of education. So his book Emile on education was...
That's right. They're highly constrained, aren't they?
Yeah, that's right.
Oh, in some families anyway.
Yeah. So they have to develop in such a way that they can act responsibly.
That's interesting because I remember I've heard talk about quantum physics. A lot of people associate quantum physics with a great degree of freedom, or the quantum realm, but it's actually highly constrained.
Yeah, that's right.
Realm. It's actually the quantum.
Well, there's some kind of
least degree of freedom of anything in many ways.
There's some kind of indeterminacy, but indeterminacy might be a necessary condition to talk about freedom, but it's not enough by itself. Yeah. The idea that Anaximander had, I think, is incorporated into process philosophy. So he was really an early process philosopher before Heraclitus, who's normally taken as the originator of process philosophy. So the idea of there being a kind of flux that develops order through constraints, that's the idea that's been revived, really, I suppose, by Schelling incorporating Kant's ideas into his cosmology. Mm-hmm. And that's the idea that I've argued we should be aligned with. It's associated with communitarianism, reviving ideas from from Kant and Hegel and so on, but naturalizing those ideas.
So this idea of freedom is what we need to focus on, I think, because it gives us a sense, and this idea of political development and ethical development being tied to the limiting or the constraining of, I guess, what we think about as our fundamental impulses. What many philosophers have said is what distinguishes us from other forms of life on the planet, for instance, our ability to be able to do this. And that gives us a way then of being able to measure the development of people and of societies and of civilizations in regard to how they've been able to learn self-restraint, how they've been able to limit themselves in various ways in such a way as it's opened up new possibilities for them.
That's right. The opening up of new possibilities is really important because that's counterintuitive in some ways, that you're constrained implies you've lost freedom. But it's by virtue of having, the rule of law that people are not sort of constantly under threat of people attacking them. So they're much freer. They can do more things. So people who have got integrity are able to cooperate in a way and do things that people without integrity can't achieve.
Yeah, you can, in a society like ours, hopefully you can park your car somewhere and walk away from it.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
It's going to be good chance it's going to be there when you come back.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it gets us to the idea of homes as well. One thing we need to talk about, I guess, is the concept of ecopoiesis.
Yeah, homemaking.
The concept that you've developed in the idea of ethics, and of a home being somewhere as well, which provides the conditions by which you can venture out. The secure conditions, if you like, or the constraints in which you can then explore the world and have somewhere to come back to.
Yeah. So the notion of eco could be translated as home or household, and it was generalized politically, well, particularly by the Swedes, talking about society as the people's home. So you try to create a home in which everyone's got economic security, people are looked after, and so on. And that's the condition for being really free. And that's under the influence of social democratic philosophers.
So, and with ecopoiesis, I'm thinking about how we are able to. Another concept we were talking about at the end of our last talk was hierarchy theory coming out of ecology.
Yeah,
and that's something that I've used quite extensively as well to get an understanding of how the various levels within a society should work, particularly and politically, how the different levels within a society should work, and the different levels in terms of their constraining effect on other levels. You want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, well, actually, it's part of that cosmology, going back to Anaximander, but revived by Schelling, and then developed in the natural sciences, which now really upholds this communitarian ethics, whereas previously, with the mechanical view of the world, it seemed to support Hobbes and the mainstream economists. But if you think about, physical reality, it's based on continual emergence of new kind of constraints. So the constraints on elementary entities create the possibility of atoms. Atoms then have new possibilities of entering into molecules and the like. Molecules, by virtue of constraining the atoms, are able to enter into more complex relationships, and eventually you get life forms developing. And that's associated with new constraints again, associated with the interaction between different organisms and what have you. So in ecosystems, and organisms can be characterized as highly integrated ecosystems, there are a whole hierarchy of levels of organization. There's communities within communities, and humans evolve within that. And you can see that they've added new kind of constraints associated with the development of culture, which includes language, but also moral notions, defining people's roles in society, and also the kind of instruments they develop, their technology as machines and the like. And by virtue of that, they're able to do things that no other organism could do, which includes, developing science, philosophy, along with technology, developing new kind of organizations, communities. And so the history of humanity has been associated with more and more complex kind of communities developing, more and more complex kind of political organizations, leading up to, I think, the United Nations, which is an effort to create a global political order that guarantees the freedom of every nation to develop its full potential to contribute to humanity. And that idea was developed, first of all, by Rousseau in relation to Europe, but then Schelling generalizing that to the whole of humanity. And then it was put forward as the League of Nations and then the United Nations. And I think that was an incredibly important development.
Yeah. One that has been continually sought to be undermined over the years, isn't it?
Well, unfortunately, it was the Americans who really pushed the League of Nations, Woodrow Wilson, and then the United Nations, and it was Franklin Roosevelt who actually came up with the name United Nations. He died, and subsequently America, sort of becoming the dominant power after the Second World War, tried to manipulate the whole system through the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund and then the World Trade Organization to serve its own interests. And you had the development of neocolonialism. So you did have United Nations providing the conditions for the breaking up of empires, and that was really important. But then neocolonialism involves the other side of our culture, the one that's associated with the mechanical view of the world and the development of economics. So what you wanted to do was open up poorer countries so that the wealthy countries could exploit them. And that began with the overthrowing of Mossadegh in Arran, who was trying to nationalize oil so that the wealth of the oil would benefit people in Arran. And that started a whole history of neocolonialism. But at the same time, you had that struggle between, the communist countries and the West. The West portraying itself as being on the side of freedom, whereas the communist countries tended to support third world countries who were trying to free themselves from that neocolonialism. And then in 1990, the communists lost out in the Cold War. And subsequently, we've had a reinforcement, an intensification of neocolonialism.
And this gets us to the quality of constraints, isn't it? And in terms of hierarchy theory as well, thinking about what is like you talk about the idea of facilitative constraints.
That's right, yeah.
As opposed to destructive constraints. And what is it that distinguishes one from the other?
Yeah. Well, you can see in a prison, you've got destructive constraints. You don't have any possibilities of developing your full potential. You're just regimented. And
you get good at making number plates.
That's right. Yeah. Well, you can in that regard. I suppose there's a difference between communitarianism and collectivism. Collectivism, like in Stalinism, tries to regiment everyone and is really hostile to people who are individualistic. So a lot of the supporters of communism ended up being executed during the purges in 1937 and 1938. And what I found is that it's very difficult for people to appreciate the difference between the two. When you support communitarianism, they assume that you're supporting collectivism, which is oppressive. I mean, it's not entirely oppressive because, Stalin industrialized the country, which enabled it to defend itself against the Nazi invasion. But in the long run, it led to stagnation. Somehow you have to have those conditions for people to develop in new directions.
Well, one of the guiding ideas from Hegel that I've always been influenced by was the question that they say the question that most obsessed Hegel, I guess, in his work was why aren't modern Germans like ancient Greeks?
Mm-hmm.
And so he was always trying to question, like he recognised that communitarian spirit within ancient Greek society.
Yeah.
But now he said that, you've got generations of people who've gone through the Reformation, for instance.
That's right, yeah.
And have become more individualistic.
That's right, yeah. So you had to give a place to that.
Yeah, how do you create that sort of collectivism or communitarianism within a bunch of individuals?
That's right. So I think that he was really important, and I think he was influenced by both Plato and Aristotle, and then the subsequent history of the development of their ideas by people like Aquinas. But he was rethinking it from the foundations up. He was more of an idealist than a naturalist, which I think is a problem. And Schelling, I think, is superior in some ways because he reformulated those ideas on naturalistic foundations. But if you think about what Hegel was doing in the philosophy of right, Aristotle had made empirical studies of constitutions, and he said there are proper constitutions which are committed to the common good. Mm-hmm. They're either ruled by one person, which is a monarchy, they're ruled by some people, which is an aristocracy, or they're ruled by the many, the broader citizenship, but always for the common good. Then there are the degenerate forms of these. So when monarchy degenerates, it becomes tyranny. When aristocracy degenerates, it becomes oligarchy. When democracy degenerates, it becomes something like ochlocracy, mob rule.
It's like chaos, yeah.
Yeah. Well, it can be something that's not quite that, but still pretty bad. Aristotle suggested the possibility of a mixed constitution, and this idea was developed by Polybius and then Aquinas. And I think people who defend democracy really accept mixed constitutions. Hobbes and Locke weren't democrats at all. Hobbes was defending really an enlightened tyrant, saying they're enlightened because he should act in a way that won't lead to rebellion.
And Locke was defending sort of the emergence of a new
oligarchy,
new capitalist class almost, wasn't it?
An oligarchy associated with people just pursuing wealth. Now, Aristotle had looked at this and said that this can be a problem, and he characterized it as eudoxia, I think. I'm not sure of the term, but he looked at Sparta and what had happened to it, he said that the pursuit of wealth had led to more and more people being enslaved because the concentration of wealth became so extreme. So in the end, there were only 1,000 citizens left in Sparta. All the rest were slaves. And so they weren't able to defend themselves against the Macedonians. They were defeated.
Oh, and you wonder whether there's a book on Sparta in the Swinburne Library, wouldn't you?
Yeah, well, that's been eliminated. But you can see that this is what was going on with the development of capitalism under the influence of people like Locke, Hobbes and Locke, and economic doctrines, and it's still a huge problem. Sismondi recognised this in 1819, that capitalism led to depressions because the people who did the work weren't provided with the income to buy what they produced. So you had this periodic cycles of depression, each one more severe than the predecessor. So Hegel was aware of this problem, and he, in his philosophy of right, saw that it was this that led to imperialism, where people tried to find markets outside their own society because their own citizens weren't given the income to buy what they produced. So he came up with the idea of a constitution which was a mixed constitution, where you had the family, which should be outside the market, the relationships there based on love, civil society based on egoistic interests, as in what Hobbes and Locke were defending, but where workers were empowered by what he called corporations, which we call trade unions or professional bodies controlling...
Sort of representative bodies, yeah.
Yeah, and having power. And then the state, which he said couldn't be just a matter of individual contracts, it had to have the family principle united with that individualism, upholding the common good and controlling the market to make sure that it served the common good. And it also dealt with things like, war and all the rest of it. So I think that's the basic idea of social democracy.
And fundamental to that too is Hegel's idea of recognition, isn't it?
Oh yeah, well that's a really important development, upholding, the communitarian tradition in a way that went beyond the Greeks, and it really goes back to Fichte. So Kant, in developing Rousseau's ideas, but in a fairly individualistic way, talking about the I think that accompanies all our perceptions. Fichte said, well, how do you develop that notion of the I, that unity? It can't be just a thing that you identify in isolation, because the I already presupposes the other. And he realized that you only develop your sense of the I through seeing yourself through the perspective of others. And it's more than that, because what you want is recognition of your significance.
Yeah.
And so you can see that there's an impetus to extend recognition to others, because that's the condition of you developing a satisfactory identity, something that you're going to be inspired by. Now that was, I think, a brilliant idea. It was taken up by Hegel, and he looked at the whole of the history of humanity, giving a central place to that dialectic of recognition. So I said that in the beginning, with the ancient pharaohs, only one person was recognised as significant.
Like the master-slave dialectic, you say?
Well, the master-slave dialectic came a bit later, because that we had some people recognised as free, but the majority of the population enslaved. But the pharaohs' lives were terrible, because they were the only person who was significant. Any recognition they got was meaningless. With some, you get some improvement.
It's lonely at the top, Arran.
Yeah, it is. Yeah. You get some improvement, but it's still really problematic. And the people that they subjugate and reduce to instruments are... they're not deprived of a sense of meaning in their lives, but the masters are, because the recognition they get from the slave is devalued by having reduced the slaves to just instruments. Hegel went beyond that, because he was also looking at the evolution of what he calls the dialectic of representation. Yeah, Hegel went beyond that, because he recognized that you have a representation of what you're doing, and that develops through history. And so he looked at the evolution of our worldviews. That's the dialectic of representation, showing that the major advances were sometimes made by people who were oppressed, and this is really what you had with Christianity. The people who were oppressed extended that notion of recognition to everyone, but they were slaves, so they didn't think you could get it in this life. It was projected onto the afterlife. So at the end of your life, you sort of eventually ended up in heaven. But it was at least an ideal, that everyone should be recognised as significant. And these Christians sort of took refuge in monasteries and the like, and the Roman civilization collapsed because of the decadence of this ruling elite that had no sense of direction. And these ideas were preserved with modernity. He said, what you've got is the quest to recognise everyone as significant in practice, in our institutions, embody that recognition in our institutions. So his political philosophy was about recognising that significance in our institutions and developing institutions that would give people a sense of their significance as members of families, as involved in a profession, or citizens of a state. Now, Hegel, Schelling going beyond Hegel, argued that this has to be extended to recognition of all other societies. So that's where you get the idea of, the United Nations, or the precursor to the United Nations, the idea of recognising all these diverse nations as significant, and that being the basis of their recognition of you, counting.
But once again, you need some sort of hierarchy. Like you need levels within this system. You can't expect the state to recognise everyone equally or effectively. You need different levels within that.
Yeah, that's right.
The community in which people can find that recognition or find that significance.
That's right. That's why you have to have families, and why you have to have those corporations or trade unions. Yeah. And if you look at Australia, that was strongly influenced by people influenced by Hegel. This is associated with the recognition of trade unions and giving them a central place in society, which was eventually subverted by Hawke. That's really important. Also, he recognised the importance of local government, and that became more important as the nations got bigger and bigger. So Switzerland, which was another country that influenced Australia, has taken this further, the idea that you decentralise power as much as possible. You decentralise power to the cantons, and from the cantons to the communes, and you put a lot of responsibility in the hands of those communes. So you need a hierarchical, federated structure, which is what Australia had initially under the influence of the Swiss.
And this is what people missed today when they complain about the various levels of government, and they complain about the slowness or inefficiency of these various levels, and how you could streamline things much better if you cut out all of these different levels.
And centralise things, that's right. There was the thing in terms of centralisation.
To me, it's like building a freeway, from one city to the next. And in the process of doing that, you just starve all the little towns along the way.
That's right,
destroy all the little communities along the way. So you're not, and that's what happens when you centralise things like that and you take these away. So the people aren't seeing the significance other than some sort of economic efficiency.
Yeah, that's right. So everything again is dominated by that Hobbesian way of thinking again, which reduces everyone to just instruments. But it's disastrous, really. And then they dismiss local government. Well, it tends to be corrupt, but the messiness of democracy is rejected because they want efficiency.
Yeah.
But then they say, well, efficiency is achieved first of all by centralisation, but then outsourcing everything. So you put everything in the hands of the people operating in the market, trying to maximise their own incomes.
Just recently, I had some dealings with our management and at Swinburne, and they had centralised all the processes in management.
Yeah.
And so basically taken responsibility of all of us and put all the responsibility onto them.
Yeah.
And then I missed out on a particular grant or something because I didn't get it in on time. And then they said, the problem was it was all my responsibility. It was my responsibility to get it all done and get it in on time. Yeah. So the whole thing was just like a sham.
Yeah.
Like a system designed to avoid responsibility.
Yeah, that's right. Well, this is the problem that, the domination by the market led to the bourgeoisie, exploiting the proletariat and creating depressions. You had a reaction against that. But the direction that's now taken is associated with the growth of transnational corporations, and things like universities. Organisations like universities are no longer public institutions, they're transnational corporations, and they're dominated by managers, and the managers siphon off the income as much as possible into their own pockets. They supposedly are more efficient because they reduce the number of staff, but that means that they're effectively destroying the education.
But as has been argued in a recent book on the free market, these universities as transnational corporations, like all transnational corporations, are highly dependent on government and communities.
Yeah, they are. But what they have tended to do is take over control of the governments, through the control of what politicians get into power, who they fund in their campaigns. I mean, you can see that most clearly in the United States. You have to have millions of dollars to be able to win in the House of Representatives.
Yeah.
Generally, you have to be a billionaire to sort of have a chance of becoming president.
Or a fake one.
Yeah, a fake one, yeah. Well, actually, I suppose a billionaire gives you a bit more freedom. The people like Biden, who are totally under control of the military-industrial complex and the financial sector, are just ciphers for the people who have real power.
So what do we do with all of this in our modern situation? I know that in your work for a while now, you've been arguing for a sort of multipolar global international organisation.
Yeah, that's right. I think that you have to have a multi-leveled federation from the United Nations downwards. And the collapse of the Soviet Union led to a monopolar world where the Wolfowitz doctrine was that nobody should challenge America's domination of the world. They called it a rule-based order, but one where the country that implemented or imposed those rules, the United States, didn't feel compelled to abide by the rules that it was imposing on other people, and continually changed the rules. And you can see this in the sequence of wars, where it wanted access to their oil or whatever. So rejecting that, I think that the idea of a multipolar world is part of that move towards multi-level federation. It doesn't go all the way because you need, diversity at lower levels. In my view, European Union should be a federation, and that should be one of the centres. Eurasia should be another. South America another. Perhaps the Islamic countries another.
Federations would provide far more autonomy to the member states, you mean?
And then within those nation states, they also should be federated. So just like in Switzerland, eventually empowering people at the local level. But it's an incredibly difficult thing to achieve. I mean, the Swiss succeeded in developing their federation after, constant threats of invasion and then wars between the different cantons. So eventually they internalised this importance of recognising, the diverse other cultures within Switzerland, because they speak 4 different languages. They've got Catholics and Protestants and so on. Yugoslavia tried to model itself on Switzerland with more diversity, with Islamic societies, Orthodox Christian, Catholic and so on. And eventually, they didn't succeed. It broke up. So you can see how it's an incredibly difficult thing to achieve, especially when you've got United States doing everything that it can to break up these societies to serve its own interests, to prevent these countries uniting to have governments that serve their own populations.
And the problem we've got with the idea of a multipolar world at the moment is that much of the world is turning to fascism.
That's right. Well, this is, I think, partly because of the vacuum created by the failure of what used to be regarded as the left, the social democratic or democratic socialist left, which are now green socialists or eco-socialists. Yeah. But somehow they've lost the plot. And I think part of the reason is because they haven't recognised having to give a place to the notion of the nation. They see the nation as oppressive. So in the vacuum created by that, people turn to fascism in response to that neoliberalism, which says, like in Thatcher, there's only individuals, family in the global market. Well, you've got no sense of community. It's really devastating to communities and to people. it leads to higher levels of violence and crime and what have you. So people turn to fascism as a response to that. And fascism then supports neoliberalism as people react against fascism. So as Varoufakis said, they actually end up supporting each other. Each is a reaction to the other. But it's the lack of the alternative that's really astonishing.
Because the nation state that the left are reacting against is largely a Hobbesian one too, isn't it? Like
It is, yeah. But it doesn't have to be that.
Which can be justifiably argued against.
It can, yeah. But if you think about the First Nations, there was the Dutch Republic in Switzerland at the end of the 30 Years' War. The Treaty of Versailles recognised their autonomy. That was in 1648. And Switzerland, I think, is the best example. The Dutch Republic went on to become an empire, which subverted its original ideals. But it's out of that you get Rousseau coming up with the notion of a nation and supporting it, and a national culture. The idea was then taken up and developed by Herder, who argued that every nation should recognise it's got a culture and cultivate it and recognise its uniqueness, cultivate it to some extent, its uniqueness. So the ideas of the nation originally were quite radical and connected to the commitment to being democratic. The development of a culture that enabled people to be cultivated so that they could govern themselves. Somehow the left lost the plot. You did get a subversion of that idea, with Nazism and so on, but it's questionable whether you can regard Nazism as nationalist. It was racist, which is a regression to bloodlines and so on, not people being part of a territory. Benedict Anderson said that a nation is an imagined community. It's a territorial ideology, people living in a particular territory, governing themselves. And you can have diversity in that territory between different groups of people, as you had in Switzerland.
And this is where ethics and politics mesh, and it meshes through understanding the process involved in both ethics and politics. That it's not something. I think the left lost its way as well, in embracing sort of that postmodern idea of the constant present.
Yeah.
And rejecting that sort of development of virtues, for instance.
Yeah.
The development of virtues as being a sort of a conservative idea.
Yeah.
But really, that's where it comes together, doesn't it? I mean, you really have to have the development of virtues amongst people. You have to have the development of people, their maturity.
Mm.
You have to have the creation and development of people who can then create and develop political systems of great maturity as well. Which
That's right, yeah.
Account for diversity, can be tolerant and...
Yeah, well, the notion of culture is connected to the notion of cultivation.
Yeah.
But it's also associated with the idea of traditions, which means being passed on from generation to generation. So upholding traditions, and this is to some extent...
Memory.
Yeah, memory.
Yeah.
Defended by conservatives. I mean, conservatives aren't neoliberals. Genuine conservatives aren't neoliberals.
No.
So the left needs, as Hegel did, learn from people who are
radical.
Yeah. It's a radical rejection of tradition and communities. Now, those traditions being passed on have to be understood as narratives, stories. You have to pass on a story of what you're all about from generation to generation and continually reformulate those stories. And individuals need to situate their own lives as lived out stories in relationship to the stories they're participating in.
And this has been, I think, at the heart of your work in politics, has been this effort to remind people, like Australians, for instance, your efforts to remind Australians that we have this story.
That's
that
right,
we have
yeah.
this story in which our development or our telos, if you like, was a better one than we had one at one stage.
We did,
We
yeah.
had a direction, and we were moving in a direction towards greater inclusion or whatever.
Yeah, Australia Federation was developed partly under the influence of the British ideas in response to the depression of the 1890s, which was not quite as bad as the 1930s depression, but it was pretty bad. And so they recognised that free markets was not the way to go. It also locked Australia into being just a supplier of raw materials to Britain, which they didn't want to do. They wanted to create a national economy. So we had a commitment to being a nation implementing the most advanced ideas on democracy. And for some reason, people have just turned their back on that, including people who thought to be left-wing, which I find really strange. It's partly, I suppose, the influence
which
of
was the conditions for the union
Marxism.
movement too. Like,
Oh, yeah, that's right, yeah. Well, that defence of the unions was, as I say, connected to Hegelian-type philosophy, because the unions had been banned in Britain after the French Revolution, which accounted for how appallingly oppressed the workers were in early 19th century Britain, and why it had those depressions of underconsumption. So Australia had these brilliant ideas. We've just forgotten our own history. We've, in a sense, lost the plot. But that idea of stories is most fully defended by Alistair McIntyre, who I think is one of the most important of the communitarian political philosophers, going back to Aristotle and then Aquinas, and defending a radical dimension within the Catholic tradition of thought associated with the Jesuits and Pope Leo XIII, who also argued, we have to avoid free markets, influenced by Aristotelian thought.
Well, throughout much of history, the merchants have been the most reviled of people, haven't they?
Yeah, because the destructive effects could be seen.
Yeah.
But the importance of stories, to some extent, revived, ideas of the Roman Republicans when the Greeks had history, great history, but it was the Romans who recognised the importance of it in defending their republic against the empire. And then in the Renaissance in Italy, you had a revival of interest in history and the development of historiography, which was a major source of the revival of the Greek ideas and so on. But that was taken up and developed by Vico and then by people like Herder and then by Hegel and Schelling. So the absolute importance of history, not in just about the past, but it's the process of self-creation. You have to be able to situate yourself in history to be able to play a significant part in creating the future.
And this is where the dialectical method that Hegel promoted is so important as well. The idea from Hegel, for instance, that you look to what people, you look to the telos, if you like, which is usually some form of freedom, which is a form of positive freedom.
Yeah.
And then you look at what it is that gets in the way of a community creating that level of freedom.
Yeah.
And then we can see throughout history, and we can see in Australia's history, this constant force against the cultivating of Australian virtues, this constant force against restraint or constraining free markets. This constant force trying to enrich itself at the expense of everybody else. This constant force that holds much of the population in contempt.
Yeah, but it's really the capture of the culture by the ruling elites who are now managers, and their effort to exclude the rest of the population from participating in defining our place in the world and upholding just one narrative, the narrative of extension of neoliberal markets and so on, the global corporatocracy. And it's really difficult to fight that because they're subverting all the institutions, the newspapers, investigative journalism has almost disappeared. The Murdoch press has dominated our media, promoting these ideas. They've bought out all the small newspapers in country towns and closed them down. Then you've got the transformation of the education system, particularly universities, transforming them into business corporations, which don't have any place for the humanities because they've got no place for democracy. I mean, humanities is really the education required to cultivate the kind of people who can govern themselves. And it should be central to all education. And it was at one stage. It's not anymore.
Yeah. And so here we are, Arran, in a bit of a mess, aren't we?
We are.
And we see...
And what you've got is a population who have no understanding of history. They
and as a result, also a population ill-equipped to deal with the scale of the crises that we have looming
That's
in
right,
front
yeah.
of us as well.
And they respond in really self-destructive ways, promoting political correctness, even if they're right. They exclude dialogue. Dialectics is really about dialogue. It's different ideas confronting each other and trying to learn from each other, being critical of each other.
Yep.
And that should be extended to relationships between different civilizations. It's called transculturalism, the idea of learning from other civilizations, being critical of them, but also respecting them and being respected in return. And I think that's the central idea of the United Nations. All that's sort of broken down. As Hobbes argued for, knowledge is reduced to knowledge of how to control things, which can be then sold as a commodity because it improves the saleability of your labour power in the marketplace, and everything else is dismissed as just entertainment. Literature, history, all those things are sort of not taken seriously. So it's a huge problem because you can see this. Habermas talked about the need for the public sphere. Well, that's where people should be discussing things. And this was influenced by Hannah Arendt, who was looking at how ancient Greek democracy functioned. So you have to have this public sphere. We don't have really a public sphere anymore because not just because of the way in which the ruling elites dominate, because people censor each other in everyday life. If you try and start talking about these political issues, the environment or whatever, you're sort of regarded as impolite.
Yeah. And worse than that, you get everything is monetized, or everything is infected with corporates or sponsorship, or you can't find a place to talk anymore which isn't being infected somehow by someone trying to sell something to you.
That's right. You can see how the humanities, insofar as they survive, try to promote themselves as part of the entertainment industry, selling something.
So I think, and the importance once again, I think, of thinking dialectically in terms of what it is that is stopping us from achieving the world we want to achieve. It. First we have to think about what sort of a world we want.
Yeah. Well, what's stopping us also is the the doctrine of scientism, which goes back to positivism, the idea that there's a scientific method, you apply that and you accumulate knowledge, and then you process it with computers and the like, redefine it as information, and redefine us as information processing cyborgs.
In our next podcast, we're going to be talking about technology. But I wrote a paper on Society 5.0, political implications of that.
Yeah.
And that, of course, to me, that seemed to be a system designed to actually end politics in a way.
Yeah.
Because it destroys people's. Well, it's designed to make people comfortable in such a way as they don't have to think about anything like that.
Yeah. Well, our Fornborg has pointed out that technology, for the most part, dominated by ruling elites, has always been oriented towards disempowering workers and empowering those who dominate them.
Yeah.
And if you look at its supposed efficiency, its efficiency is mainly displacing who does the work and who gets the freedom. So often, a lot more work is required to achieve anything, but the work is done in factories in China or something like that.
And of course, philosophers have been a huge part of this story in their general mistrust of their fellow human beings or fellow citizens to be able to participate in the political process as effectively as they do.
Yeah. Well, Castoriadis is, I think, really important because he points out that what people should be cultivated to do is take responsibility for their institutions. And that involves questioning them, but that doesn't mean just totally rejecting them. It can be associated with appreciating their importance, but then taking responsibility for them, upholding them and developing them, reformulating them to deal with new problems, that kind of thing.
And that's what our university should be focused on more than anything.
Yeah, and it's what people should be doing in everyday life.
Yeah.
Universities used to be centres of culture. that a university where people from outside universities would go and listen to public lectures, that kind of thing. They don't play that role anymore.
Certainly not where we are.
No.
All right, thanks, Arran. That was I think we solved the world's problems today.
We just have to convince everyone else.
We just need an enlightened, multipolar world.
That's right, yeah.
Full of mature, virtuous citizens.
That's right, yeah.
Easy.
With a strong sense of their own history.
We'll start tomorrow. Okay. So thanks for joining us on the Physicians of Culture Philosophy podcast, and we'll see you in the next one.